crystal glass. Omar Alfared sneered in Arabic, making the dinner table erupt in laughter, certain the American waitress understood nothing. Sarah Collins bowed her head, her hand trembling as she set down the wine. But seconds later she lifted her gaze and replied in flawless Arabic. The crystal glass does not lower the one who holds it. It only reflects the dignity of the one who drinks from it. The entire hall froze. The billionaire who mocked her now stood stunned as the waitress spoke more fluently than a native. Sarah stood under the golden glow of the chandeliers in the six-star Dubai Hotel's dining hall, her plain black uniform fading into the shadows of marble walls and velvet drapes. She was 25, her brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail, a faint scar above her eyebrow catching the light. Her beauty was quiet, unpolished, like a pebble smoothed by a river. Not the glittering kind that demanded attention. Raised in one of America's wealthiest families, adopted by a linguistics professor who taught her discipline and the power of words, Sarah carried herself with a restraint most mistook for weakness. But the guests here didn't see that. They saw her scuffed shoes, her unadorned hands, and they assumed she was nothing, a nobody in a room of power and privilege. This wasn't her usual shift. Sarah had been called in last minute covering for a coworker who didn't show. Her mom back in Ohio was battling cancer, and the medical bills were a relentless tide, swallowing every dollar Sarah could earn. Her feet ached from hours on her feet, her shoulders tight from carrying heavy trays of crystal and silver. Walking into this private dining hall reserved for tycoons and politicians felt like stepping into a lion's den. The air was thick with cologne and condescension, and eyes followed her, judging her before she even reached the table. A woman in a sequin gown leaned toward her friend, her voice a sharp whisper. "Is that really the best they could find to serve us?" Sarah's jaw clenched, but she kept moving her tray steady, her face a careful mask. Omar Al-Fared sat at the head of the table, his silk suit gleaming, his presence commanding the room. He was 50, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes and a tongue sharper still, the kind of man who thrived on making others feel small. His daughter Isla sat to his left, a 22-year-old student studying abroad, her dark eyes scanning the room like she was memorizing every face, every word. The table was a parade of wealth and ego, a politician with a crooked tie and a laugh that rang hollow, a media mogul with slicked-back hair and a Rolex that screamed money, and Clara, a socialite whose pearls and fake smile masked a cruel streak. They were here for a gala dinner, a night of deals and displays, and Sarah was just a prop in their game. Before Omar's words sliced through the air, Sarah felt a deeper cut. In the kitchen, during a rare moment of quiet, her phone buzzed in her apron. She slipped it out her heart, sinking as she read the text from her cousin insurance, denied mom's treatment again. "We're out of options." Sarah's breath caught her fingers, gripping the phone so hard her knuckles whitened. She'd been fighting for her mom for months, working every shift, calling every office, pleading for help. The news was a punch she couldn't dodge. She shoved the phone back, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped back into the dining hall, her face composed but her hands trembling slightly. That's when Omar's voice rang out, his Arabic sharp and mocking, and the laughter hit her like a slap. Sarah's tray clinked softly as she set it down on a side table, the sound barely audible over the guests' chatter. A man in a tailored suit, his cufflinks flashing, leaned back and pointed at her apron, his voice loud enough to carry, "Did she make that herself? Looks like it came from a discount bin." The table snickered heads, turning to stare at Sarah's plain uniform, the hem slightly frayed from too many washes. She adjusted a glass on the tray, her finger steady, but her lips pressed into a thin line. A woman with diamond earrings chimed in her tone, mocking, "Maybe she's saving up for something better. Good luck with that on a waitress's pay." The laughter swelled again, a cruel undercurrent pulling the room along. Isla shifted in her seat, her fingers pausing on her glass, her eyes flicking to Sarah with a mix of guilt and curiosity. Sarah didn't look up. She moved to the next table. Her steps measured her silence louder than their words. Sir, gleaming under the chandeliers, snorted. "Tips in that outfit. She's lucky we let her in the door." The laughter rolled on each guest, piling on their voices a cruel chorus that bounced off the marble walls, growing louder, sharper. A young man in a velvet jacket, his hair gelled to perfection, leaned across the table, his voice drip. The laughter from Omar's comment still echoed when Clara leaned forward, her voice sweet but venomous. "Letting someone like her serve us is already a blessing, don't you think?" The table roared, glasses clinking as if she had told the joke of the century. Sarah's hand shook as she poured water for the politician, the liquid sloshing just enough to betray her nerves. She caught Isla's gaze for a split second. Isla wasn't laughing. Her fingers twisted a napkin, her lips pressed tight like she was holding back a storm. Sarah kept her head down, placing a glass with precision, her movement steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Omar leaned back, his smirk wide, his Arabic cutting like a blade. Look at her fumbling like she's lost in a street market. No idea where she is. The politician chuckled, his face flushed from too much wine, his tie slipping looser. "Probably just here for the tips," he said, nudging the media mogul. The mogul, his hang with sarcasm. "I bet she's never even been to a place like this before tonight. Look at her holding that tray like it's her first day." The guests nearby chuckled their eyes, darting to Sarah as she adjusted a plate, her fingers brushing the silverware. A woman with a fur stole tossed her head back, laughing. "She probably thinks this is the height of glamour. Poor thing." Sarah's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't pause, moving to refill a water pitcher. Her face blank, but her eyes catching the light for a moment, sharp and unyielding. Isla's napkin was now crumpled in her lap, her knuckles white as she gripped it. The room's laughter felt like a tide pulling everyone along except for Sarah, who stood steady against it. The insults grew personal, biting deeper. "Does she even speak English properly?" Clara said, her voice carrying to the next table, loud enough to draw a few heads. "I bet she's from some dead-end town thinking she's hit the jackpot working here." The media mogul nodded, sipping his wine. "Probably can't even spell Dubai." A woman in a red dress at the end of the table giggled, her voice high and mocking. "Look at her shoes. Did she borrow them from a thrift store? They're practically falling apart." The room felt colder, the air heavy with their amusement, like a weight pressing on Sarah's chest. Sarah paused, her hands still for the first time. She straightened her eyes, locking onto Omar's. The room didn't notice right away, but Isla did. Her napkin fell to her lap, her breath catching. Sarah's voice was calm, her Arabic so clear it seemed to hum in the air. "The crystal glass does not lower the one who holds it. It only reflects the dignity of the one who drinks from it." The words landed like a thunderclap. The laughter died. Omar's smirk vanished, his face paling as if he'd been slapped. The politician coughed his tie, suddenly choking him. A VIP, a woman with a diplomat's badge pinned to her dress, gasped, "She understands Arabic." Isla's eyes sparked a small smile breaking across her face like a crack in a dam. The table was silent, forks, frozen glasses hovering in midair. Sarah didn't move. She stood there, hands clasped in front of her, her gaze steady but not defiant. The media mogul shifted his Rolex, glinting as he tried to laugh it off. "That's unexpected," he muttered, his voice trailing off. Clara's pearls clicked as she swallowed hard, her face flushed, her confidence cracking. The air had shifted like the room was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. A server from another table, a young woman with a tight bun, hesitated as she passed Sarah, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. Omar recovered first, his laugh force switching to English to reclaim control. "She probably memorized a few tourist phrases. Don't be impressed." Clara jumped in, eager to dismiss her. "Exactly. It's just mimicry, nothing real, like a parrot in a cheap uniform. The politician nodded, trying to regain his swagger. Let's not get carried away. She's still just the help. Whispers rippled through the guests, their voices low but sharp. No way she's fluent, one said. She's bluffing, another muttered. Omar folded his arms, his eyes narrowing. If you really know it, prove it. Say something worth hearing. As Sarah reached for an empty wine glass, a woman in a gold dress, her nails painted a glossy red, tapped her fork against her plate, the sound sharp and deliberate. Let's have some fun, she said, her voice loud enough to draw eyes. Recite something impressive, or are you just a one-trick pony? The table laughed, a few guests clapping like it was a performance. Sarah's hand paused on the glass, her fingers tightening for a split second before relaxing. She didn't look at the woman, but her shoulders squared her posture, shifting just enough to command attention. Isla's eyes widened, her breath shallow, as if she knew something big was about to happen. Sarah set down the glass, her movement slow, deliberate, like she was giving them time to stew in their doubt. She looked at Omar, her face calm, her eyes sharp with clarity. Then she spoke, reciting a poem by Al-Mutanabi. Her voice soft, but carrying the weight of centuries. The words flowed like a river over stone, each syllable perfect, the rhythm alive with history. A scholar at the table, a man with thick glasses and a quiet demeanor, nearly dropped his fork. That's extraordinary, he said, his voice trembling. Only someone who's lived in the Arab world, studied it deeply, could speak like that. The guests turned to Omar, their eyes expectant, some almost accusing. Ela leaned forward, whispering, Baba, she got every word right. Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. Omar's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping the table a nervous rhythm. Clara's face flushed, her pearls suddenly heavy around her neck. Sarah didn't linger. She moved to the next guest, refilling a water glass, her face unreadable like she hadn't just turned the room upside down. A man with a neatly trimmed beard, his cufflinks engraved with his initials, leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with condescension. Pretty words for a waitress. Bet she learned it to impress tourists. His comment drew a few chuckles, but they were quieter now, less certain. Sarah's hand paused mid-motion as she set down a pitcher, her eyes flicking to the man for a moment before returning to her work. The room watched, waiting for her to bite. But she didn't. Omar wasn't done. His voice rose sharp and desperate to regain control. Poetry's easy. Flowery words don't mean you understand anything real. What do you know about finance? Trade? He nodded to the media mogul who grinned and leaned forward, asking Sarah a complex question in Arabic about regional commerce tariffs and oil markets. The politician chuckled, muttering, This will trip her up. Clara sipped her wine, smirking. Let's see her fake this one. The question was dense, layered with jargon and numbers meant to confuse a trap designed to expose her. Sarah listened, her head tilted slightly, her eyes bright with focus. The question was a maze of terms and figures meant to make her stumble. Isla's hands clenched under the table, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on Sarah. Sarah didn't hesitate. She answered in Arabic, her voice clear, laying out a detailed analysis of trade routes, economic impacts, and specific figures from recent deals. She cited data like she'd written the reports herself, her words precise, her logic unassailable. The politician's jaw dropped. He clapped slow at first, then faster. That's not just fluency, he said, his voice carrying across the room. That's expertise. The room shifted again. Guests looked at Sarah with new eyes, some with awe, others with unease. Omar's face was tight sweat beading on his forehead, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Isla's hands relaxed, her eyes shining with something like pride. Sarah nodded once polite and moved to clear a plate, her movements as steady as ever. A man at the far end of the table, a diplomat with gray hair and a quiet presence, leaned toward his neighbor. "Who is she?" He whispered, his voice, barely audible, but heavy with curiosity. A woman in a sapphire blue dress, her earrings dangling like chandeliers, tilted her head towards Sarah, her voice low but cutting. "She's probably just showing off to get attention. People like her always do." Omar's voice cut through low and bitter, trying to claw back control. "A servant's still a servant. Language doesn't change your place." Clara laughed, sharp and cruel, her pearls glinting in the light. "Exactly. She's just tonight's entertainment. Let's not get carried away." A few guests nodded, their smirks returning, trying to pull the room back to their side. Sarah's lips curved just a fraction. Not a smile, but something sharper, like she'd heard it all before and was tired of it. She didn't respond. She kept working her hands steady, her eyes scanning the table like she saw through every one of them. The politician leaned forward, his voice loud, trying to rally the crowd. "She's probably exaggerating. No one like her could know that much." The media mogul nodded his slick hair, catching the light. "Let's be real, she's a waitress. This is all an act." The words hung heavy, waiting for Sarah to falter. She didn't. She set down a tray, her movements deliberate, and spoke her Arabic deep and resonant. "Yes, I was a servant, but I was also the student of Professor Youssef Al-Hassan, language advisor to the government." A hush fell over the table as Sarah's words sank in the name of the renowned professor, echoing in the silence. The politician nearly knocked over his glass, his hand shaking as he caught it. "I knew the professor," he said, standing, his voice trembling with disbelief. "He only took the best, the most brilliant students. If she studied with him, she's exceptional." The hall buzzed, heads turning eyes wide with astonishment. Isla gasped, her hand covering her mouth, her voice a whisper. "I can't believe it." Omar's face was pale, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles whitened. Sarah didn't look at him. She kept working her face calm, her hands steady like she hadn't just dropped a bomb that shattered the room's assumptions. A guest in a black tuxedo, his watch glinting with diamonds, cleared his throat, his voice laced with skepticism. "Even if she studied with him, she's still here serving us. Doesn't that say enough?" His words were meant to sting, to pull the room back to their side, and a few guests murmured in agreement. The whispers grew louder, the room alive with questions. Who was she? How did she know so much? Omar's voice broke through, shaky but defiant, his pride wounded. "If she's so great, why is she working here? A real talent wouldn't lower herself like this." Clara sneered, her pearls glinting as she tilted her head. "Exactly. Probably making it all up to save face." The media mogul leaned back, smirking, his confidence returning. "Let's see her prove that one." The air was thick with tension, the guests watching, waiting for Sarah to crumble under the weight of their doubt. Sarah sighed, her gaze unwavering like she'd been expecting this moment all along. She reached into her apron, pulling out an old envelope, its edges worn, but stamped with a royal seal that gleamed under the chandeliers. She opened it carefully, her finger steady, and read aloud in a clear, steady voice. "Full honorary scholarship granted to Sarah Collins, signed by Omar Alfared." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the hall. Omar's face went white, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with shock. Years ago, he'd signed that scholarship, one of hundreds, and forgotten her face, her name, her existence. Sarah looked straight into his eyes, her voice calm but piercing. "You forget many, but we never forget you." A woman with a silver clutch, her lips painted a bold red, gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest. "She's connected to Alpha Red." She whispered loud enough for the nearby tables to hear her. The room's murmurs grew a wave of shock, rolling through the guests. Sarah folded the envelope, her movement slow and deliberate, and slipped it back into her apron. Isla's eyes filled with tears, and she stood her chair scraping softly against the floor. She crossed the room in a few quick steps, throwing her arms around Sarah, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her shoulders shaking. Sarah hugged her back, her face soft but firm, her presence steady as a rock. The applause started slowly, a few hesitant claps from the back of the room, then grew into a roar. Guests stood their faces a mix of shock, admiration, and unease. Omar sat frozen, his world crumbling, his hand still gripping the table like it was the only thing holding him together. The politician shook his head, muttering unbelievable, his voice barely audible over the clapping. Clara stared at her wine glass, her face red, her pearls suddenly too tight around her neck. The media mogul looked away, his smirk gone, his confidence shattered. Sarah stepped back, her work resuming as if nothing had happened. But every eye in the room followed her now. A man in a white suit, his cufflinks catching the light, stood up, his voice, loud but unsteady. "This doesn't change who she is tonight. She's still serving us." His words were a desperate grasp at control, but they fell flat, drowned out by the applause. Sarah paused, her hand resting on a chair, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. She didn't speak, but the tilt of her head, the slight raise of her eyebrow, said everything. The room's energy shifted again, the mockery now a fading echo. Isla wiped her eyes, returning to her seat, her gaze never leaving Sarah like she was seeing her for the first time. The night didn't end there. By morning, the story had spread like wildfire. A guest's shaky phone video of Sarah's reply went viral, racking up millions of views in hours. Comments flooded in raw and real. She shut him down with pure class. Who is this woman? Omar got what he deserved. The media mogul's company dropped him from a major sponsorship deal by noon. His name dragged through the mud online. Clara's social circle turned on her, her invitations to elite events drying up like a desert stream. The politician's smug face was memed across the internet. His blessing comment mocked relentlessly his campaign ads suddenly pulled from rotation. A week later, a local reporter stopped by the restaurant. Her notepad clutched tightly as she approached Sarah during a break. "Miss Collins, your stories inspired so many people," she said, her voice earnest. "Can you tell us what it felt like to stand up to them?" Sarah leaned against the counter, her apron folded over her arm, her eyes distant for a moment. She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the edge of a coffee cup. "It felt like telling the truth," she said, simply then turned back to her work, leaving the reporter speechless. Omar faced the worst of it. His company's board called an emergency meeting, and by the end of the week, he was out, his reputation in tatters. No one said Sarah did it. She didn't have to. The truth had done the work like a tide pulling down everything in its path. Isla came by the restaurant a week later, her eyes red but warm. A small notebook clutched in her hands. "You changed everything," she said, pressing the notebook into Sarah's hand. It was filled with handwritten apologies, each line shaky but sincere. Sarah nodded, slipping it into her pocket without reading it, her face calm but her eyes soft. Years ago, Sarah had sat in a cramped Cairo apartment. Her adoptive father, Professor Al-Hassan, teaching her Arabic by candlelight. His voice, rough but kind, echoed in her ears as she walked home that night. The Dubai skyline glowing against the dark. "Words are power, Sarah. Use them wisely." She'd been a kid then, soaking up every lesson, every language, every moment of his quiet pride. She carried that now in her scuffed shoes, her plain uniform, her unyielding strength. The city hummed around her, but she walked alone, her steps steady, her heart heavy, but whole. Sarah's life didn't change much on the surface. She still worked double shifts, still sent money home for her mom's bills. But something was different. The way she carried herself, the way her eyes met the world, it was stronger, surer. She'd always known who she was, even when the world refused to see it. Now they couldn't look away. One evening, as Sarah wiped down a table, a young girl no older than 10 approached her, clutching a crumpled drawing. "I saw you on the internet," the girl said, her voice shy but clear. "You're so brave." She handed Sarah the drawing, a sketch of a woman standing tall, surrounded by falling stars. Sarah's fingers traced the lines, her lips parting slightly, her eyes softening. She knelt down, meeting the girl's gaze. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but warm, folding the drawing carefully. "You've been there, haven't you? Felt that sting when someone looks down on you, judges you for what you wear, where you come from, who they think you are. You've stood in rooms where you didn't belong, where the air turned cold, and you kept going. You held your ground not with anger, but with a quiet strength that said more than words ever could." Sarah's story is yours too. In a way, it's about standing tall, about letting the truth speak when the world tries to silence you. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone.